deniability and division of space and time.
Okay.
So in order for something to be covert, it doesn't mean it's never discovered. Covert just means it has the plausible deniability, right? So even if like the shadow of a doubt is really what we're looking for, even if someone's 95% certain, as long as they're 5% uncertain, you still maintain a level of covertness, right?
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's not certain.
Yeah.
That uncertainty is where we thrive.
Mhm.
So not only does it make sense for the CIA to work with the mob in the past, it
Yeah.
makes sense for the CIA to work with the mob right now.
Interesting. How so?
Because if the
I'm actually
mob
gonna
does
ask you.
something,
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, we're expanding about that.
yeah, because any action that the mob takes, they're the ones that take responsibility for it. Whether or not they're funded through some cutout that's backed by the government, or whether or not there's an informant inside the mob that the crime boss doesn't realize is there, one way or the other, there's a benefit there that the United States government can use to keep Americans safe.
Hello, Tom Lavecchia here with the latest edition of the New Theory podcast. Let me adjust it. I'm coming from a nondescript location today because we're talking with Andrew Bustamante, ex-CIA member, if you will. And I'm used to talking to criminals. I'm used to talking to bad guys. But today is one of the good guys. Andrew Bustamante, welcome to the New Theory podcast. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm good, Tom. Thanks very much for having me, man. And I like your nondescript location. It's got a nice view of nothing and a gray wall, man. It's very, very, very well done.
Well, I contacted our mutual friend Jim D'Iorio, and he says no identifiers.
You nailed it, man. You totally nailed it. Outside of the fact that I know that you're in a daytime place, that's all I got.
There you go. All right, so we're gonna jump right in. So you're not like kind of not that there is a typical CIA guy or gal, but you're not like from that normal ilk where they historically recruited from. So, give us kind of quick and dirty how you got into it and kind of why you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So, I think that it's great that you point this out right out of the gates. There's a huge misconception about what the modern day CIA is. And even when the modern day CIA started, right? Yeah. So if you do a quick search of, CIA officer or retired CIA officer, you're going to find a long lineup of old, gray-haired, Caucasian, overweight men. Yeah. It's just what you're going to find, right? And that's because someone who retired recently came into CIA, 30 years ago with a whole different generation, a whole different attitude, right? Just think how much the career, the workplace culture has changed. Correct. I mean, my parents were loyal to one employer for 30 years.
Yep.
Their parents were loyal to one employer for 50 years, right? So that's the world that was. Everything changed for CIA in 2001. When 9/11 happened, when the Twin Towers came down, when almost like a whole new version, a whole new edition of what intelligence looks like inside the United States. Yeah. It was the birth of what's known as the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. It was the birth of TSA. TSA didn't exist before 2002, 2003, really. Yeah. And it all came about as a result of 9/11. One of the big changes that also came about as a result of 9/11 is CIA realized they had been outpaced by the current modern day threats. They were still fighting with an old Cold War mentality. They were still worried about the Russians. Even in 2000, 2001, we were focused on the Russians, not counterterrorism, not counter nuclear proliferation, not drugs, not human trafficking, not emerging threats. We were still looking backwards.
Yeah.
So forced CIA to change. One of the things that they forced them to change was their entire recruitment structure. No longer could they only pick Ivy Leaguers. No longer could they only pick white, male, straight, conservatives. They had to diversify. And one of the big ways that they diversified was by looking to non-traditional recruiting methods, going to colleges, going to tech fairs, going to arts festivals, right? And trying to find a more diverse group of people. So ultimately in 2007, I was leaving the US Air Force, and recruiting directly from the US military became one of those methods that they approached. So when I went to leave the US Air Force, I was applying to go into the Peace Corps, actually, to try to go save the world, one beautiful hippie chick and one orphan at a time. That was my mission in life. And I got a tap on the shoulder and said, hey, we know you want to go to Africa, going to Africa undercover. And that's kind of the beginning of my story, man. And I've never looked back since.
Wow, that's amazing. And Andrew, thank you for your service. So you go, into the CIA, and obviously I know you can't speak to specifics, but what was your expectation on what the assignments were, and what was the reality of it when you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Oh man, my expectations and the reality couldn't have been more different,
Yeah.
because I was 100% like all of us. I went in thinking that there was at least some glimmer of truth in what you see in Hollywood and what you read about in books and what you see in magazine articles, right? I was looking for custom-made suits and fast cars and luxurious cover identities. That's what I was expecting. But the reality is so much different than that, because what I learned is that if you're going to be invisible, you're going to be forgettable, if you're going to be the gray man, if you're going to be undercover, you have to have nothing that anybody even notices about you. You don't want to be attractive. You don't want to be well-groomed. You don't want to be wealthy. You don't want to be important. You don't want to have influence or authority. You literally want to be a mildly overweight middle manager of a factory that produces something that is completely disinteresting. That's what they want, right? Which helps me understand so much more about why the previous generation of officers all look so similar. Why is it that all those retired CIA officers basically look like, the lead mechanic in an auto retailer tire shop?
Yep.
Because that's the forgettable gray man of 1992.
Interesting.
But nowadays, the forgettable gray people are very different. There's a benefit to being brown. Now there's a benefit to being female. Now there's a benefit to being much more diverse than what it was in the 90s.
Now, going in 2007, that's it is about 6 years after 9/11. And I'm assuming the CIA had a certain culture, and then you're part of the new guard, new direction, new resources, new technology. And just like any organization, criminal organization, company, or the CIA, were you kind of part of that changing guard and the culture? And if so, was it like, were they, hey, this is easy, I have autonomy? Or was it difficult because you're kind of the new guy, new technology, and it was a culture shift that the old guard wasn't, on board with? If you don't mind me asking that.
No, these are super informed questions, man. Really, really well done, because you're exactly right. So it's a giant corporation. And just like most corporations, when change is forced upon you by the outside, it's very rarely adopted quickly or smoothly. Right. And CIA didn't have a change management process, because they were born out of the 1950s, out of the OSS. They were born out of the military, and the military doesn't change.
Yeah.
So they really didn't have a sophisticated process for shifting their own culture, shifting their organizational structure, and organizational change and change management were major, major challenges for them. On top of that, they also had the curse of abundance, because unlike a corporation that has to earn its money,
Correct.
CIA is given money by Congress, and then they're responsible for showing that they can steward and spend that money responsibly. So in 2007, when I came on board as part of a massive hiring push to spend congressional dollars that had been allocated after 9/11, while simultaneously they were being forced to restructure and change their organizational culture from a culture of Ivy Leaguers who have to go through years of service before they earn the right to become a group chief and whatever else, to more of a meritocracy that was attractive to a younger, more tech-savvy generation, right? So it was a huge challenge. And, it's funny because as a brand new CIA officer getting trained to go to the field, I was not sensitive to most of the leadership change. Yeah. I was really just focused on my own self. What training do I need and where do I need to go? But I kept running into these bureaucratic blockades that I didn't really understand until years later, when I myself became a manager at CIA. And then I started to realize, oh, there's like and continuous learning, and there's career broadening, and there's America that have been ingested into CIA to transform this outdated culture. And people just didn't know how to do it yet. And of course, it's not the kind of company that can just hire an outside consultant to come in and teach you change management, because that outside consultant has to go through a 6 to 9 month clearance process before they can actually be told what's actually happening in the office.
That's amazing. So, okay, so you're out in the field, you're doing your thing, and just like any job, you need feedback, you need leadership, you need direction, right? So obviously get great training, probably the best training in the world. How do you get feedback from the field, from your manager, from your colleague? It's not like you sit down for a performance review, or you didn't kill enough people or whatever it is, like how do you, like, you have your mission, it's mission critical, you're doing your thing. I'm obviously somewhat objective, but you're kind of acting every day. How do you course correct, or are you out there on your own, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. A big part of the job is learning how to operate in ambiguity. Okay. Because while there are avenues for feedback, that feedback is very rarely ever timely. So just as an example, if I operate on Monday, most likely I am going through a surveillance detection route that could take anywhere from 1 to 6 hours before I actually do my operation. My operation might take anywhere from 30 minutes to 12 hours. Yeah. And then afterwards, I'm doing another 1 hour to 6 hour surveillance detection route to exit my location. So within a 24-hour period, you might work for 20 hours to do one operational element.
Crazy.
Right?
Yeah.
So then you'll make notes, but you'll essentially go to sleep, wake up the next day, and do bureaucratic reporting. All of the intelligence reporting, all of the operational reporting, you'll tell your boss and your boss's boss, and you'll talk to your peers, and everybody will know what you did 24 hours after you actually did it.
Interesting.
But then on top of that, there's a review process for all of the operational details. So it'll go through your direct supervisor, it'll go through your supervisor's supervisor. Think about it kind of like an email that has to be approved before it's sent out the door. That's how we communicate internationally. So it takes 2 or 3 people to review what you wrote before it actually gets approved, and every one of them wants to edit something or change something. We don't want to use this word because it puts us at legal problems, or we don't want to use this statement because it might upset this person from another division. So you've got all this. It's all the inefficiencies of corporate America and all the inefficiencies of working undercover. So by the time your operational details make it to headquarters, it might take anywhere from 3 to 7 days, and then they go through the same process before they provide you feedback. So you might have 14 days worth of operations before you get a single piece of feedback, and then amplify that over the course of the year, and you can see that annual reviews are not an easy thing, and quarterly reviews are not an easy thing, and corporate KPIs are a whole different language that CIA doesn't understand.
Interesting, because I've always thought it'd be the opposite, because, and I guess my question is, what does like a shitty CIA guy look like? Does he accidentally start a war? Does somebody escape? Like, because there's good people at their job and there's people that suck at it. What does a shitty CIA guy look like?
Yeah, it's funny because a shitty CIA guy kind of looks like any other shitty employee that you could imagine, right? I mean, if you start cheats on their spouse, doesn't complete their reports on time, dresses and smells like a lush, right? Or they smell like too much tobacco, they smell like too much weed, whatever it might be. You've got that kind of CIA officer because it's a very stressful, demanding job. Yeah. So that's the far extreme of like real train wreck. And CIA has a way of handling those people, because what it can't do is fire them, because they're a government employee with access to secret information. So just like many corporations, they have their own internal ways of, promoting these people up into positions where they are out of harm's way, where they can't damage the agency, right?
Interesting.
The more kind of typical substandard case officer or substandard CIA officer is just somebody who doesn't put the mission first. It's the kind of person who's taking extra time off or always late delivering their ops reports doesn't push themselves or push their assets to collect real meaningful intelligence. I mean, we've all been in conversations where we know that we could push harder. A CIA officer's job is to always push harder, push to the very limit, because the intelligence that we need to keep Americans safe is not easy to collect. You can't walk up to somebody and say, hey, how's your day? How are things going? Are you a terrorist?
Yeah.
That's a conversation that doesn't happen, right? You have to spend days, weeks, months before the person trusts you enough to actually show you that they participate in some kind of illicit activity. So good CIA officer will take the time to get close to that target, where a bad CIA officer will just be like, this person is definitely a terrorist. That's not actually good intelligence, right?
Yeah. So when I talked to Jim, Jim Diario, for everybody who's watching, former guest and a friend, we talked about cultivating assets, cultivating informants. How do you pick your mark, and give us step one on how to cultivate an asset?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes the hardest step is choosing your target, which is why the real step one that we have is something called spotting.
Okay.
And what spotting means is spotting is a process or a system by which you put yourself into an environment that would reasonably have multiple targets.
Yeah.
If you take it out of spying and you put it into, let's say, dating, right? If you want to find a date, you can do it one of two ways. You can spend hours on the internet scrolling through profiles, trying to find the one person who fits you perfectly. And then you can send that person a message and stare at your computer waiting for them to respond. You can do that. Or you can get your ass up and you can go to a nightclub that has a ladies' night where drinks are half off.
Yeah.
When you put yourself in the nightclub where you've got 50 women who are all there for drinks half off and they're all dressed to the nines, you're putting yourself in a target-rich environment.
Yeah.
And that is what we call spotting. So now you can shake 50 hands, you can flirt 50 times, and the probability is that one of those women is going to smile back, say hello, and at least have a conversation with you.
Interesting.
Whereas the person who's spending all of their time online targeting, the probability is that they will have to probably target 10 or 15 people before they get one person to respond to their message.
Interesting. So the heritage of my show, I historically interviewed a lot of guys from like organized crime, and happen to be, many of them happen to be informants. So my question to you is, how does a asset or, a terrorist, let's say informant, how much harder or easier is it? Because I heard both extremes. I heard on one end, you give them like, a goat and like a few bucks, they'll turn. And then I heard when there's a religious tie-in, it's almost impossible. So give me kind of like the spectrum of informants, and how easy or how hard are they to flip and develop?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you think of informants, when you think of people, and all people are sources of information, right? You essentially have a scale that all people land on. So there's the scale of intelligence and ideology. And the more that someone leans towards their ideology, the less intelligent they really are.
Interesting.
The more that someone leans towards their intelligence, the less ideological they really are. Now, there's a lot of people who disagree with me and who are going to argue with this all day long because they're devout Christians and they have a graduate degree. So they think they're both. If you have a graduate degree and you are a devout Christian, then you know very well that you can't prove your belief system. So as long as you can admit that you can't prove your belief system, you actually land on the intellectual side of the scale. It takes work for you to be ideological. It's easy for you to be intellectual, right? So when you're talking to terrorists, when you're talking to criminals, when you're talking to scumbags, dirtbags, and bad guys of all varieties, you almost always have a situation where they are driven by an ideology and they are largely ignorant. Not intelligent. They're not thoughtful people, right? They've landed on the fact that they have to steal or hurt or kill to just survive. If they had intellect, if they had education, if they had advanced cognitive ability, they would have found a better way to make a living. But they don't have that opportunity. So then they end up being ideologically driven. Ideologically driven people are very malleable, easy to manipulate, because you know their ideology. And generally speaking, their ideology is usually take care of number one. So as long as you can take care of them better than whatever criminal organization is taking care of them, then they're going to become ideologically inclined to working with you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The flip side is also true.
Okay.
When you talk to somebody who is very intellectual, a very intellectual person is also very easy to manipulate, because you can craft things in a way that they can rationalize and understand why it's in their best interest. So whether you're talking to a terrorist or whether you're talking to a politician, right? Politicians are usually more intellectually driven than they are ideologically driven. If they were really ideological, they would have given up on politics a long time ago.
Good point.
Right? Instead, they can rationalize and they understand how to use a system and twist a system and how to lie strategically and how to gain tactical alliances. Like, they are very intellectual people. So when you have a very intellectual person, you basically just want to frame things up around whatever they can rationalize as part of their personal goals or personal objectives, whether it's wealth or fame or success or notoriety, whatever else it might be, right? The people that are the hardest to convert, the people that are the hardest to make into informants or assets, are people who have a healthy understanding and are in the middle of both, right? Your college graduate who also goes to church on Easter and Christmas and feels a sense of responsibility and guilt for doing what their parents taught them to do. That person is very wishy-washy, is assume that it's the opposite way around, that the wishy-washy person is the easiest informant and the hardliners are the hardest to convert. In fact, hardliners are the easiest to manipulate and the people in the middle are the hardest to manipulate. Interestingly enough, Tom, you see that play out in media every day. Why are news stations and news channels, why are they geared towards the extremes? Because it's very easy to incite a response from the extremes because they're more malleable. They're easier to manipulate than the people in the middle who are undecided or constantly shifting in their opinions and beliefs.
Wow. Okay. So you spot somebody, you see they're valuable, you engage them. Do you kind of have an objective, for example, a lot of FBI guys I interviewed, a lot of the, again, organized crime stuff, they would have an informant and they would be going after these 5 guys. But in their kind of investigation, so much stuff pops up serendipitously and they wind up maybe a different target or a broader scope or whatever that is. Is the CIA kind of like that in your investigations, or is it opposite? No, Tom, you know what? I got these 3 guys, I'm going after them. Or do you have to kind of course correct a lot and go back to your guys and say, no, wait a second. I think this guy's a loser. That's where we need to go. Does that happen often?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a constant developmental process. And that's what we call it at CIA, is a development process. You are not only developing the operation, but you are also developing the asset into being a meaningful source of intelligence. So we talked about step 1 being spotting. Step 2 is something called assessment. So after you find 5 targets, the next thing you have to do is assess meaningful, reliable sources of information, right? Are 2 of your 5 targets drunks? Is one of your 5 targets a criminal? Is one of your 5 targets somebody who is in debt and just out of a marriage and suffering from all sorts of mental health issues? Like, what are the levers that you can use to gain control over a different asset? And that's the part where you're kind of calling the shots in the field in real time, because you know that whatever decision you make, it's going to take 14 days before somebody says you're wrong. So let's make a decision today and let's act on it for the next 3 or 4 days. And then by the time somebody says I'm wrong, I'm already 3 days into this operation and I've got momentum on my side.
Interesting. So in terms of policy, is there like a think tank, group, theoretically, in Washington that's like, hey, you know what, we need to kind of temper that there and move that around there. And you know what, we need to get more involved in Ukraine without getting involved, right? Or is it you're in the field and you're like, hey, this is going on, maybe not give recommendations, but give this going on. And in terms of the feedback loop, there's a structure and decisions come from headquarters and you guys execute, or the opposite, you guys kind of intelligent gather and grab that, and then it goes to them, and they're more reactive and make decisions based off your actions. What you did more of? I know it's a broad question, but I just like to get a sense for that.
No, it's a fantastic question because there is a lot of push and pull.
Okay.
And as much as I would love to say that it's a collaborative push and pull, it's
Yeah.
usually a very competitive push and pull.
Okay.
Because here's what happens. Your elements in Washington, D.C., at the center of intelligence, right? They're in charge of all the funding.
Yeah.
So they need to bless your operation in order to give you the funding to execute your operation. And you need a lot of funding because you've got technical tools and you've got, transportation and logistics, and you've got a number of things that you need to support an operation. So they control the pocketbook, but they also are at the beck and call of what we call policymakers. Policymakers are the politicians that the American public votes for, who set policy priorities. From those policy priorities, certain budgets are allocated. So if Congress cares about Ukraine, they're going to allocate money to Ukraine. And then part of that money is going to be allocated to intelligence about Ukraine. Part of that money is going to be allocated to CIA intelligence about Ukraine. And then CIA will say, we need you to look up information on Ukraine, and here's your budget, right? Or any number of things, right? Whether it's rice trade in Cambodia, or whether it's, illegal immigration in Nigeria. Whatever the policymakers care about, the money flows down from them. But the ground truth flows up from the field. So they may come in and say, we're going to fund operations for Ukraine. And then during your Ukraine operations, you come across a weapons smuggler who's smuggling weapons to and from Iran through Ukraine. Well, now you can take that intelligence and float it back up and say, hey, if there's a policy priority about Iran weapons, we would like funding so we can explore this operation further. So that's kind of how it goes in both directions. Unfortunately, when you layer in the fact that they're trying to manage cultural change and try to become more bureaucratic in terms of, career broadening and professionalizing, you can imagine the conflict that happens when you've got somebody in the field who's trying to meet the requirements to get promoted.
Yeah.
And the thing that they're good at is not a current policy priority. So now how are they going to get promoted if there's no funding for the thing that they're good at? Well, now they have to compete against other people by doing the thing they're not good at, right? They're a Korean linguist, but nobody cares about Korea. People only care about South Africa. Well, this person knows nothing about South Africa. And how are they going to compete reasonably when the money isn't where it needs to be to give them an opportunity?
Good point. All right. So everyday spy we'll get to in a little bit, and it's probably the most exciting thing I'm actually to talk to you about with is all right. So first, I've got a little different question here. Is I'm a business guy, I'm an entrepreneur. My relationships matter, right? I'm a little skeptical of newer people. My average friendship is 35 years. I'm 47 years old. I'm going to go into business for somebody, right? And you're consulting me as an ex-CIA guy. What activity would you recommend that I partake with them prior to signing on? Is it golf? Is it a long dinner? Is it drinking? Is it a vacation? What activity would you say, hey, Tom, if we're going to do one activity to really vet somebody and how they're going to be in business and in life, what would that activity be?
So I'm hoping that this will surprise you, right? What I would say is you want to participate in activities that are socially questionable.
Interesting.
Because you learn the most about somebody when they are tempted by whatever their particular vice is. And every human being has a vice. Yeah, so the three areas that all human beings, we all lean towards a vice. And the three major vices are drugs, alcohol, and sex. Right? So if you're going to go into business with somebody, and especially if you're considering decades of relationship, right? Financial connection and you depend and rely and you're intertwined on this person, you absolutely have to know their chief vice. You have to know it. If you don't know it, then you're leaving yourself open to the unpredictable nature of that person.
Interesting.
So before you get into business, what I recommend is that you absolutely partake in as many social interactions that allow the opportunity to overindulge this person in one of their vices, because each vice tells you about the person themselves, right? If somebody overindulges in sex, it means that they need some kind of external validation. They need to feel powerful. That is somebody who has an opinion about themselves that is either high or low, and they need physical touch of another human being in order to satisfy that they have power or that they are being seen. So you've got a person with an unpredictable self-esteem if they indulge in sex, overindulge in sex. If they overindulge in alcohol, you've got somebody who's looking to repress a busy mind, or somebody who's highly anxious, somebody who's over thoughtful, somebody who's looking to suppress an energy that they don't understand. If you have somebody who overindulges in drugs, you're looking for somebody who's looking to escape. That's somebody who feels like the only way that they can really cope is by getting away from the life that currently exists. So when you think about who you want to do business with, generally speaking, you want to do business with somebody who shares your vice. Because if they share your vice, you can predict how they will react to different events. So if I have a vice towards alcohol and I pair up with a partner who has a vice towards sex, I don't know what that person's thinking. I can't predict what they're going to say. I don't know how they're going to react to stress. Like, good news or bad news, an investor comes in and they want to pour a ton of money into the business, or tragedy strikes and the business is in threat. You want to be able to predict how that person is going to react. So the way that you get there is by understanding the vices, and you give yourself an opportunity to where that vice can present itself.
Okay, so that makes perfect sense, and would probably save us all a lot of time if we adhere to that in the past and kind of align to it in the future. So let's just say, for lack of a better word, you want to influence somebody or manipulate somebody. What's the easiest way to do that?
Well, it's interesting. One of the easiest things that you can do is just mirror that person. Just mimic them. Physically and verbally mimic them. So if they lean forward, you lean forward. If they lean back, you lean back. If they cross their arms, you cross your arms. Because what happens subconsciously is when we see a reflection of ourselves, it triggers subconsciously a sense of trust and comfort. Because we feel like we are looking at ourselves. We feel, have you ever had that sense where you're like, oh, I really like this guy, or I really like this girl because she reminds me of myself. He reminds me of myself. He reminds me of when I was younger. I remember being like that. We naturally trust things that are familiar. Trust and influence are basically two terms that mean the same thing. If you have someone's trust, then you can influence them. If you can influence someone, then you have their trust. So the two terms are interchangeable. So the main thing, if you want to influence somebody quickly and you don't know them, is to simply just speak at the same rate of speech that they use the same vocabulary that they use, look them in the eye and mimic their behavior, and you're naturally going to get them to trust you.
Interesting, because you're kind of going to what you said is, ideology and intelligence, right? If I'm really big on, respectfully, like, I'm a business guy. I try to do stuff in the community. My family's from Italy, so I try to do a lot with, other Italian Americans. So I tend to meet somebody who's Italian American and I advance a whole load of trust, right? And then I'm like, later on, I'm like, guy's a dirtbag, so like, now I kind of see how it avalanches, and you trigger like you said, a lever or a push and pull on trust and that kind of stuff. So that's really interesting, Andrew. So how much does your training, translate to being the founder, and president of Everyday Spy, which is, we'll get to in a moment. Like, was it easy transferable, or you're like, oh shit, you know what? I don't know how to use QuickBooks. How easy or how hard was it to transfer from kind of CIA to running a business?
It was super difficult, actually.
Oh.
There's all sorts of knowledge. Yeah, there's all sorts of knowledge and skills that I learned at CIA that apply to business, but there was no roadmap to translate them. So it's like learning a new language without a dictionary. Of course, a dog is a dog no matter what language you speak. Food is food no matter what language you speak. Hot is hot, cold is cold. But if you don't know what word to use to explain to somebody that you're feeling hot or you're looking for a bathroom. If you don't know how to say it, then you're lost, right? It was the same way for me leaving CIA. I had my own language, I had my own skills, but I didn't know how to apply them in the business world. So a huge part of my experience in becoming the founder of my own company was actually going back to, like, essentially back to basics. I left CIA as a high-level leader, a manager at CIA, and I took a position that was a low-level analyst in corporate America. And having my experience at CIA, but having none of the responsibility of being a leader, gave me lots of space to succeed in my job, but also see how the skills translated into business and corporate America. And then I very rapidly gained success in my job because I was able to apply the skills that I had into my new work environment, which was something that my peers could not do because they didn't have that experience. So every step of the way, I learned the language for myself. I created my own dictionary. Oh, talking to my boss every week during our one-on-one is an opportunity for me to gain leverage and influence over my boss so that I can manipulate and direct his opinion of me, so I can essentially control when and how he advances me for promotion. Whereas most people are thinking, oh, I have another one-on-one with my boss. I don't even know what I'm going to talk about this week. Right? Consider what you were just saying a few minutes ago. You put yourself in situations where you are surrounded by other Italian Americans because that is your opportunity to rapidly develop trust. Right? Like that is a reactive approach. You're putting yourself in an environment where it's convenient for you instead of making yourself convenient, adaptable to multiple environments. Right? You could do just as well in an environment with a bunch of British Americans or Australian Americans or African Americans. All you have to do is be able to mimic their values, their vocabulary, their behavioral tendencies, and they're going to trust you.
Good point.
Right? It's the difference between having a CIA approach versus having what so many of us have, which is just the school of hard knocks approach.
Good point. Good point. So, okay, so kind of go back to CIA in a second. I think about this stuff. You see a lot of things that happen throughout history and life. And I look at it like when something's so obvious, like you guys do a good job to make it look like you guys are not doing a good job. You know what I mean? Like the whole Oswald thing, and then somebody killed Ruby, and then everybody got quiet. Like I don't know. I you probably got to ask this a million times, but like, does it, without saying anything, maybe just giving an opinion, I guess, does the whole JFK thing sound CIA-ish to you?
So this is where it's difficult. Remember how I said everything changed in 2001?
Correct.
The CIA of before 2001 didn't have oversight. They were literally they were part of the executive branch, and they were the Wild West.
Interesting.
Right? They didn't have oversight. Their funding was limited, but carved out and protected. Right? So nobody could take it from them, but also they couldn't be controlled by funding.
Got it.
So, and then of course they were all a bunch of good old boys, right? Ivy Leaguers and former military who were all super loyal to each other, arguably more loyal to each other than to the organization, which is exactly what Congress wanted to change after 9/11. Because when you have a bunch of assholes who are loyal to each other instead of the organization, shit like 9/11 happens. Right? Tragedy happens when people put themselves over the organization. There's no better lesson in corporate America than that either. If your employees are more loyal to each other than they are to the organization, they're going to kill the organization.
Good point.
Right? So when you ask me how much truth is there to all the conspiracies out there, and does JFK sound like a CIA job? Maybe. Because the truth is, everything I learned about the post 9/11 CIA. Which is much more professionalized, much more heavily governed and regulated than the pre-2001.
Interesting. Now, another one, again, I typically cover organized crime, and it's alleged that the CIA approached, Sam Giancana to go after Castro, and then for whatever reason it didn't happen. And I'm kind of like wondering, then this is a hypothetical opinion question, obviously, because we weren't even live back then. why would the CIA need the mob back then? Just out of curiosity, why would they back then, theoretically? Like, is it a proxy? Like,
Oh, well, I mean, yeah. So you got to understand that everything in covert operations
yeah,
depends on having plausible deniability and um, division of space and time.
okay,
So in order for something to be covert, it doesn't mean it's never discovered. Covert just means it has the plausible deniability, right? So even if like the shadow of a doubt is really what we're looking for, even if someone's 95% certain, as long as they're 5% uncertain, you still maintain a level of covertness, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's not certain.
yeah.
That uncertainty is where we thrive.
Mhm.
So not only does it make sense for the CIA to work with the mob in the past, it
Yeah.
makes sense for the CIA to work with the mob right now.
Interesting. How so?
Because if the
I'm actually
mob
going to
does
ask you.
something,
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, we're expanding about that because
yeah, because any action that the mob takes, they're the ones that take responsibility for it. Whether or not they're funded through some cutout that's backed by the government, or whether or not there's an informant inside the mob that the crime boss doesn't realize is there, one way or the other, there's a benefit there that the United States government can use to keep Americans safe. Imagine a mob family that's competing against a terrorist cell to control some geographical part of the city.
yeah,
The mob's the one putting in the money. The mob's the one putting up the lives. The mob's the one causing all the issues. All they need is a few more guns, rounds, and dollars. Well, guess what we're good at? We can give you that. And in the end, that's one less terrorist cell, right? So you got to understand CIA and CIA's approach to national security.
yeah,
You have to think very practically.
yeah.
Remember that intellectual ideology
Correct,
spectrum? You
correct.
have to leave ideology behind, and you
Mhm.
have to get very, very practical, very, very rational, right? How do we keep Americans safe? Because that's our job. Do we keep Americans safe by carrying around a flag and saying we believe in Jesus? No. You keep Americans safe by hurting the people who hurt Americans. It's that
Interesting.
simple.
Wow. And then, because it's interesting you say that because there were kind of, in my opinion, some mobsters over the years that may have been CIA assets because they mysteriously never really, got arrested or they kind of like, skated through the systems and that kind of stuff. And that's a whole another show to talk about. How does CIA align, like you kind of said, with scumbags? I mean, you have to kind of deal with some pretty rough people. Is it organizational choice? Hey, you know what? On this one, we actually may work with the Muslim Brotherhood because they're against Egypt or whatever it is, right? Or is it more individual by spotting certain individuals and trying to overturn? Like, how do you align to deal with some really unscrupulous people, but for the greater good? How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, the way that you reconcile it is by staying very firmly to that intellectual, rational, practical. Remember, before the Taliban was the Taliban,
Yeah,
we supported them as mujahideen in Afghanistan fighting the Russians,
correct.
right?
Correct.
During the Afghanistan war, during Operation Enduring Freedom, we were having our own helicopters shot down by our own shoulder-fired rockets that we had given the mujahideen. Right? So, I mean, there's a very, very practical element there to how CIA and not just CIA, but how the entire intelligence community executes operations. So, like, this is another great misnomer. Every time a criminal walks,
Yeah.
every time they have some kind of protection for it, people are like, oh, they must have been a CIA asset. No, they could have been an FBI asset.
Good
They
point.
could have been an NSA asset.
Yeah.
They could have been a DIA asset.
Yeah.
They could have been a DEA asset.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of intelligence. There's 18 intelligence community partners. Any one of those can essentially put judicial protection over a reporting source.
Yeah.
CIA is the one that gets the most blame. And what's the funniest thing to me is that CIA, of all the intelligence partners,
Yeah.
CIA is the only one that's restricted from operating inside the United States.
Good point.
So if a
but does
mobster
it though?
wanted
But does it?
Gorky,
Yeah. But does it though, Andrew? Ever or no?
So of course the post 2001 CIA is heavily regulated,
Got it.
right?
Got it.
It can't operate without that regulatory body approving it. So what does that look like? In practicality, what that looks like is CIA wants a source. That
Yeah.
source is in Chicago, and they work for an organized crime syndicate of Indian Americans, right?
Yeah.
CIA can't work with them, but CIA can work with FBI.
Okay.
So then CIA goes to FBI and says, hey, FBI, we need you to help us with this. Well, then FBI manages everything, and CIA just has a seat at the table. So it makes the whole thing more complicated, because now you have to ask someone every time you need something done, and every piece of information you get is coming through a filter because it's coming through someone else. But it also makes it legal and regulatable by the government. So now the government is like, CIA is not operating on American soil, FBI is operating, and FBI is advancing investigations that apply to FBI.
Yeah.
And give us an opportunity to see if there's a foreign intelligence angle for CIA. So it to most Americans, they're like, oh, that just sounds like a workaround. That sounds like a loophole.
Yeah.
It is absolutely a functionality that gives our policymakers the authority they need, but it also makes it so that you can't have another rogue CIA officer who tries to assassinate Castro by poisoning his water, right? And then the whole world wonders for the next 50 years, was that CIA? We don't know. With this new methodology, there's always a trail of accountability.
All right, because we're gonna wrap it up soon, and again, we want to give Everyday Spy its a correct coverage here. But I do have to. I'm going to take out the tinfoil hat for a second, only because you brought up the Mujahideen. I have to bring this up. Okay, so the Sicilian mafia at the time with Toto Dorina was killing everybody. Some guy named Badalamenti left, set up shop in Brazil. He needed some heroin. All of a sudden, started buying from the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen was great guys. Here's weapons. Hey, this guy, you need money? I think these guys will buy your poppy seeds. Who cares with the mafioso? That's fine. And here's resources. Then when they started turning around the guns on us, they started shooting at us. We're like, screw you, we're out of here. But then all of a sudden, that guy gets arrested and a whole bunch of other guys get arrested shortly after the Mujahideen flips on us, squelching their financial supply. So in my opinion, I feel that when the Mujahideen screwed us, we're like, fuck you. We're just going to arrest your buyers and give Giuliani a tip off. We're going to arrest your buyers and you're fucked. That's kind of like where I'm at. It's a little tinfoil hattish. What's your thoughts on that? Am I just way off, or what do you think?
No, I don't think you're way off. I think there are elements there that are rational, right? Because when you're trying to hurt the group that's hurting you, then oftentimes the way to do that is by just like starving them to death. And if you have a criminal case that you can prosecute in Brazil, but you don't have a criminal case that you can prosecute in Afghanistan, you have to go with the case that you can prosecute. You have to leverage the relationships that you have. So we probably had a better relationship with the Brazilian government than we did with the Afghan government, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes a level of practicality, man. As silly as this is, the whole conversation we had basically boils down to this very stark difference between what you believe ideologically and what you do action-wise. If you're the kind of person who does things that you believe in, you are an ideological person, and therefore that's great for you. Right. But that's not where CIA operates, right? Yeah. CIA is constantly driving people to be practical. Now, why does CIA want you to be practical? Because remember, the people that are easy to manipulate are on both sides of the spectrum. So when CIA trains its officers to be highly rational and highly practical, they do it because they can also control their officers.
Oh, that's amazing. All right. So tell us about Everyday Spy. I'm excited about it. I've been obviously following you for a while. Tell us a bit about Everyday Spy and what you're working on now.
Absolutely. Everyday Spy is my company. I started it in 2018 with a podcast. It has grown since then. We had our first $1 million annual revenue year this year. Thank you very much, man. It's super exciting. But essentially, we have a single mission, and our mission is to provide spy education that breaks barriers for anyone willing to learn. So that's what it's all about. How do we take spy lessons, spy content, spy education, just like we did today, Tom, and use it to break some kind of barrier that's holding you back? Whether it's holding you back at work, holding you back in business, holding you back in sales, holding you back with your health, holding you back in your family, holding you back with your relationships. There's a skill that we're taught that can help break your barriers, because CIA trains us, just like you said, we're the best trained assets in the world because we are trained to break every barrier put in our path. Nothing can hold us back from the operational success we must achieve to keep America the strongest, wealthiest superpower in the world. That's how we're trained. What's been fascinating and what's been a humbling kind of joy and privilege for me is that all of those secrets that CIA trains us to use to break those barriers, those secrets are not secrets that have to be kept in the halls of Langley, because they're secret in the fact that they haven't been talked about, but they're not secret in terms of being protected by federal law. Right? Because there's two types of secrets. There's secrets that have to be kept, and then there's secrets that are simply unknown. So our job, my job, and my whole company's mission is to take the things that have been hidden in the shadows and bring them to light so that they can actually serve the men and women, especially the American men and women, who pay taxes every year to enable CIA to execute the operations that it executes. Your tax dollars have paid for the skills that I know. So now is a perfect time to get those skills out of the shadows and into the light so they can serve everyday Americans again.
That's amazing. Just as I have you on the line, like I said, when you're in the New York area, love to do in studio and get together with Jim and you and Julian for dinner. But aside for that, what the heck happened on October 7th? I mean, Mossad is up there with the FSB, the CIA. Like, what happened there, man?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that I'm just as eager as everybody else to understand. Somehow, Hamas was able to organize and execute an operation without Israel predicting or being able to prevent that operation from initiating. And there's a lot that goes into that, right? There's obviously an intelligence piece that goes into that, but there's also a self-defense piece and a police piece and a law enforcement piece. There's multiple pieces there. But at the end of the day, what we saw was Hamas attacked Israel, even though Hamas knew it could not win the fight. And that's the piece that I want people to understand. Israel was provoked. Israel was provoked by a force that was militarily, strategically, and industrially unable to sustain or win the fight. Why would somebody pick a fight like that?
Unless they have somebody behind them that's bigger.
Exactly. The only reason is because they wanted to start a chain reaction. And unfortunately, what we've been watching play out in the headlines is that chain reaction, right? A reaction that makes the Palestinian plight and that brings the Arab world together, that distances the United States from Israel and Europe from Israel. This is the reaction that, in my opinion, Iran wanted when they supported and sponsored Hamas in launching the attack on October 7th.
Interesting. So my second to last question is, what question didn't I ask you that you wish I asked?
That's a great question, man. So I'm always surprised how many people don't ask about my wife, because my wife is another CIA officer. She's a former undercover CIA officer. We met undercover. We operated together. And in many ways, my wife is the strategically and cognitively superior of the two of us. She's just so strategic and so tactical in what she does that she doesn't put her face on camera very often.
Interesting. And so you really can't fuck around.
Yeah. So it's like, it's perfect. She knows my vices, and of course she knows my vices, and I'm cleared hot. Right. So but I love talking about her because she is my partner in missions, and she's kept me safe. She saved my life. But then she's also my life partner, and she's the mother of my children, and she's the co-owner of my business. And what I have found is that having such incredible transparency with a person, spouse or otherwise, has been just transformative for me, because I don't have to even try to keep secrets. It's
awesome.
just facts are the facts, and we can operate from the same point of view.
That's awesome. Last question. You could have dinner with anybody, dead or alive. Who is it and why?
If I could have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, I would choose to have dinner with my great grandchild, because I want to know. I want to know if I did life right. I want to know, did my son or daughter turn into the father or mother who carried on the family values, who carried on the points of view and the belief systems that we carry? Like, did we make it 3 generations? Or when I sit down with this great grandchild, do they not know who I am? Are they a complete departure from anything that I care about, anything I believe in? Like, have I done it right? We don't ever get to know that question, right?
No.
And we oftentimes think about people that we want to meet from the past, but for me, all the people I want to meet are in the future.
Yeah, and it's a great point, because being 47 and I'm trying to earn more money for my family and try to but also be present at the same time. And Everyday Spy could probably even help with some of those skills, develop those skills. And I'm like, well, when is it too early to worry about legacy? I kind of want to make my mark and then worry about legacy. And a wise man told me, if you wait to make your mark, wait to make your mark and then think about legacy, it's too late. So the fact that you're that prophetic and want to talk to someone in the future, it really says a lot. I'll put your link below, Andrew. And how can people find you?
People find me by visiting my website, everydayspy.com. You can also find me on every social media channel at Everyday Spy. And then, of course, you can find my podcast on YouTube or on any place where you listen to podcasts.
You're the best. Have a great day, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.